Chapter 15. The Merchant of Venice. Shylock the Jew lived in Venice. He was a usurer who had amassed an immense fortune by lending money at great interest to Christian merchants. He was a hard-hearted man and was much disliked by all good men, and particularly by Antonio, a young merchant of Venice. And Shylock hated Antonio in equal measure, because he used to lend money to people in distress and would never take any interest for the money he lent. Antonio was the kindest man that lived, and was greatly loved by all of his fellow citizens. But the friend who was nearest and dearest to his heart was Bassanio, a noble Venetian, who had nearly exhausted his little fortune by living in too lavish a manner that his slender means could not support. Whenever Bassanio wanted money, Antonio assisted him. One day Bassanio came to Antonio and told him that he wished to repair his fortune by a wealthy marriage with a lady whom he dearly loved, whose father that was lately dead had left her sole heiress to a large estate, but not having money to furnish himself with an appearance befitted the lover of so rich an heiress, Bassanio besought Antonio to add to the many favors he had shown him by lending him 3,000 ducats. Antonio had no money by him at the time to lend his friend, but expecting soon to have some ships come home laden with merchandise, he said he would go to Shylock, the rich moneylender, and borrow the money upon the credit of those ships. Antonio and Bassanio went together to Shylock, and Antonio asked the Jew to lend him 3,000 ducats upon any interest he should require, to be paid out of the merchandise contained in his ships at sea. The Jew now said, "Signor Antonio, on the Rialto or exchange many a time, and often you have railed at me, and I have borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the badges of all our tribe, and then you have called me cut-throat dog, and spun at me with your foot, as if I was a cur. Well, then it now appears you need my help. Has a dog money? Is it possible a cur should lend 3,000 ducats? Antonio replied, "I'm as like to call you again and spurn you too. If you will lend me this money, lend it not to me as to a friend, but rather lend it to me as to an enemy, that if I break, you may with better face exact the penalty." And then Shylock, pretending kindness, said he would lend him the 3,000 ducats and take no interest for his money. Only Antonio should go with him to a lawyer, and there sign in merry sport a bond, that if he did not repay the money by a certain day, he should forfeit a pound of flesh, to be cut off from any part of his body that Shylock pleased. "Content," said Antonio, "I will sign to this bond." At last, against the advice of Bassanio, Antonio signed the bond. The rich heiress that Bassanio wished to marry lived near Venice, at a place called Belmont. Her name was Portio. Bassanio, being so kindly supplied with money by his friend Antonio, at the hazard of his life, set out for Belmont, and attended by a gentleman of the name of Gratiano. Bassanio proving successful in his suit, Portio in a short time consented to accept him for a husband. Bassanio confessed to Portio that he had no fortune, and that his high birth and noble ancestry was all that he could boast of. She who loved him for his worthy qualities, and had riches enough not to regard wealth in a husband, answered, "Myself and what is mine, to you and yours is now converted. But yesterday, Bassanio, I was the lady of this fair mansion, queen of myself, and mistress over these servants. And now this house, these servants, and myself are yours, my lord. I give them with this ring," presenting a ring to Bassanio. Bassanio was so overpowered with gratitude and wonder at the gracious manner in which the rich and noble Portio accepted a man of his humble fortunes, that he could not express his joy to the dear lady, and taking the ring, He vowed never to part with it. Gratiano and Nerissa, Portio's waiting maid, were in attendance upon their lord and lady, when Portio so gracefully promised to become the obedient wife of Bassanio, and Gratiano, wishing them joy, desired permission to be married at the same time. "With all my heart, Gratiano," said Bassanio, "if you can get a wife." Gratiano then said he loved the lady Portio's fair, waiting gentlewoman Nerissa, and that she had promised to be his wife if her lady married Bassanio. Portio asked Nerissa if this was true. Nerissa replied, "Madam, it is so, if you approve of it." Portio willingly consenting, Bassanio pleasantly said, "Then our wedding feast shall be much honored by your marriage, Gratiano." The happiness of these lovers was sadly crossed at this moment by the entrance of a messenger, who brought a letter from Antonio. When Bassanio read Antonio's letter, Portio feared. It was to tell him of the death of some dear friend. He looked so pale. Bassanio then told Portio of his borrowing the money of Antonio, and of Antonio's procuring it of Shylock the Jew, and of the bond by which Antonio had engaged to forfeit a pound of flesh, if it was not repaid by a certain day. And then Bassanio read Antonio's letter, the words of which were, "Sweet Bassanio, my ships are all lost, my bond to the Jew is forfeited, and since in paying it impossible, I should leave, I could wish to see you at my death. Notwithstanding, use your pleasure. If your love for me do not persuade you to come, let not my letter." "O my dear love," said Portio, "dispatch all business and be gone. You shall have gold to pay the money 20 times over, before this kind friend shall lose a hair by my Bassanio's fault." Portia then said she would be married to Bassanio before he set out, to give him a legal right to her money, and that same day they were married, and Gratiano was also married to Nerissa, and Bassanio and Gratiano, the instant they were married, set out in great haste for Venice, where Bassanio found Antonio in prison. The day of payment being past, the cruel Jew would not accept the money which Bassanio offered him, but insisted upon having a pound of Antonio's flesh. A day was appointed to try this shocking case before the Duke of Venice. Portia, who feared it would go hard with Antonio, began to think if she could by any means be instrumental in saving the life of her dear Bassanio's friend, and at once resolved to go herself to Venice and speak in Antonio's defense. Portia had a relation who was a counselor in the law. To this gentleman, whose name was Bellario, she wrote and stating the case to him, desired his opinion, and that with his advice he would also send her the dress worn by a counselor. When the messenger returned, he brought letters from Bellario of advice how to proceed, and also everything necessary for her equipment. Portia dressed herself and her maid Nerissa in man's apparel, and putting on the robes of a counselor, she took Nerissa along with her as her clerk, and setting out immediately, they arrived in Venice on the very day of the trial. The case was just going to be heard before the Duke and Senators of Venice in the Senate House, when Portia entered and presented a letter from Bellario, in which that learned counselor wrote to the Duke, saying he would have come himself to plead for Antonio, but that he was prevented by sickness, and he requested that the learned young doctor Balthasar, so he called Portia, might he permit it to plead in his stead. This the Duke granted, much wondering at the youthful appearance of the stranger, who was prettily disguised for her counselor's robes and her large wig. And now began this important trial. Portia looked around her, and she knew the merciless Jew, and she saw Bassanio, but he knew her not in her disguise. He was standing beside Antonio, in any agony of distress and fear for his friend. The importance of the arduous task Portia had engaged in gave this tender lady courage, and she boldly proceeded in the duty she had undertaken to perform. And first of all she addressed herself to Shylock, and spoke so sweetly of the noble quality of mercy, as would have softened any heart but the unfeeling Shylock's, saying that it dropped as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath, and how mercy was a double blessing. It blessed him that gave, and him that received it, and how it became monarchs better than their crowns. And she bid Shylock remember that as we all pray for mercy, that same prayer should teach us to show mercy. Shylock only answered her by desiring to have the penalty forfeited in the bond, as he not able to pay the money. Asked Portio. Bassanio then offered the Jew the payment of the 3,000 ducats, as many times over as he should desire, which Shylock refusing, and still insisting upon having a pound of Antonio's flesh. Bassanio begged the learned young counselor would endeavor to wrest the law a little, to save Antonio's life. But Portio gravely answered that law once established must never be altered. Shylock, hearing Portio say that the law might not be altered, it seemed to him that